Now, as you know, not all communication is helpful. Not all communication is constructive. Think fake news. Right? Communication can disintegrate community. Communication makes community possible, but communication can also problematize community. So this occurs when wants, which are not mediated by shared interests, threaten community. So, for example, internet violence or incitement, bomb making recipes, these are kinds of communication which are not mediated by shared interests, and they actually can threaten community. So, Dewey's point here is that our interdependence in our communication technologies can cause power imbalances. Economic and industrial forces are real, and the solution to these problems, right, these imbalances, is not unrestrained speech, but more communication. Communication that's guided by intelligently educated habits. Now, another issue that he discusses is economic threats to community. Right? Dewey speaks out against determinism in our economic life, about industrialism, economic market forces, about income distribution. And Dewey argues that these are not natural outcomes, not just the way things are. He speaks about repetitive or stressful jobs. Again, these are not inevitable, these are not necessary. And he notes that even supposedly free markets are not really free. They're full of mechanisms, they're full of rules that are designed, chosen, and enacted consciously. The question then becomes, how is control over these forces possible? In other words, what conditions must be met in order for a community to exercise control over itself democratically, right? Or for a community to form and fully exercise enough control so that it could be a democratic community? Well, here are some basic conditions. Information has to be fully and easily accessible and available to all. There have to be mechanisms for acting on information. Right? People have to be interested in acting. So, this is really beyond what was traditionally thought necessary for a self-regulating democracy. Why? Well, because the traditional thought was that all democracy needed was intelligent, competent individuals, right? Omnicompetent citizens, and general elections, right? Educated citizens and general elections. The problem with this assumption, Dewey thought, was that omnicompetence in voters doesn't happen without education and communication. Omnicompetence as a notion about rationality alone doesn't appreciate how habit influences logic. We are trained to think logically. And so habits help us understand. Right? The existence of habits as a psychological phenomena help us understand why there could be rapid scientific and technological change and yet very little ethical progress. So you might think of some examples, right? There are more machines and higher productivity, and yet there are still long work weeks. There's high gross domestic product and national productivity, and yet there are still millions of people who are still poor, who still don't have health care. There are sophisticated communications technologies all around us, and yet people are still uninformed about their government, about their environment, about their local neighborhood. So what does this amount to? How do we get a democratic public, a community? The public in a democracy requires, Dewey thought, critical intelligence. Information plus self-reconstruction is the key. So democracy, Dewey thought, could only be fulfilled by educated citizens, where educated means the ability to possess information and have the self-reflection, the abilities to self-reflect that can shape and reshape habits. So intelligence is a combination of both possessing information and being capable of deciding what's valuable for oneself and for others. So the ingredients of democracy are knowledge and ethics, and they can't be separated. Democracy requires both. In fact, there's a greater and greater need, Dewey thought, for this kind of critical ethical intelligence. Why? Well, because our tools are increasingly more powerful. Industry and technological change is multiplying and accelerating, Dewey said. Information is multiplying and accelerating. And what this means is, with these bigger and more powerful tools, we're also in greater danger of bigger errors. Witness the atomic bomb. Witness, right, environmental collapse as a potential problem, right? This is a problem, and it's multiplied, especially in an environment which is also more powerfully, at least potentially, propagandistic, right? And he writes, of course, there has been an enormous increase in the amount of knowledge possessed by mankind, but it does not equal, probably, the increase in the amount of errors and half-truths which have got into circulation. In social and human matters especially, the development of a critical sense and methods of discriminating judgment has not kept pace with the growth of careless reports and of motives for positive misrepresentation. So in many ways, the public's understanding of the tools is lagging behind the tools, right? We're not keeping up with the tools of science, the tools of technology, the tools of communication. And you could consider the statement of Dewey's in light of our own tools of mobile technology, right? The surveillance and data collection that they permit, let alone their ability to manipulate our actions. About this, Dewey is again prescient. He writes, they do not understand how the change has gone on, nor how it affects their conduct. Not understanding its how, they cannot use and control its manifestations. They undergo the consequences, they are affected by them. They cannot manage them, though some are fortunate enough, what is commonly called good fortune, to be able to exploit some phase of the process for their own personal profit. You might think of the heads of Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, right, as being good examples of that. You might consider as another example the downstream effects of the automobile, right? It changed habits, it changed lifestyle, it changed our geography, our architecture. It had a profound ecological impact on us, our lives, on the planet. It changed our international political relations, right? It led to wars over resources. In other words, even the shrewdest inventors, and of course the public who knows a lot less about the invention that's coming down the pike, doesn't foresee the ramifications of the invention. They didn't see the ramifications of the automobile, and they didn't see the ramifications of a lot of social media. So, one word about the publicity in the media piece of this. There are problems, Dewey thought, with the source of information, because the primary tool of a democratic public is communication. And it's impossible to have a democratic public if information is limited, if it's distorted, or it's manipulated. It makes it impossible to even do social inquiry. Whether this is hype or persuasion, distraction, triviality, or fragmentation of our attention, the perversion and pollution of information disrupts the ability of the public to move towards democracy in the wider and fuller sense, using inquiry and shared values and community-building communication to, search for the great community. So, in conclusion, in the end, Dewey's discussion of the media is ultimately about the habits of mind or the epistemic virtues that are necessary for inquiry. There are certain intellectual and emotional habits that also make exploitation possible. We all have tendencies, all of us, towards automatic reverence, towards unreflective reverence of certain ideas, certain institutions, The Supreme Court or the police or the two-party system, or the infinite resilience of the environment. We have all these idées fixées, as we might say, We have a facile optimism about the future, That problems will just go away, or they'll heal themselves, or everything will be okay. We glorify the way things are, The things as they are. We're distracted, we're fragmented, we're intimidated by dissenters, right? Or we're worried about dissenters, right? We think of them as unpatriotic, as radical, right? We're worried about protests, we're worried about critical thinking. We're often dominated by one kind of vocabulary, right? The language of efficiency, the language of technology, the language of profit and loss, right? All of these things, Dewey said, can replace genuine, authentic inquiry with ignorance, prejudice, class interest, and accident. And academics are not immune to this either. So these, in sum, are the major factors at work in the proposed conversion of a great society to a more coordinated, associated, empirical, and community-driven great community. It involves critique, but such critique also points the way towards positive forms of reconstruction. And this is really what Dewey is all about. So that's the end of this lecture on Dewey's piece. Thank you so much for listening and for watching. I look forward to talking with you about it.